Government Gay, Alex Reynolds series, Book 1. Writer, Fred Hunter, St. Martin's Press, New York, 1997. Narrator, Eric Arst. Dedicated for Joan Edwards, who told me so. Chapter 14. The cab ride back downtown to the CIA recruitment office would have been silent were it not for the fact we had one of those cabbies who delight in telling you their life stories. Given the strain we were under, I found his monologue exceptionally irritating. It seemed like hours before we arrived at the Federal Building. We caught the elevator to the 17th floor. Thankful there weren't any passengers getting off before we did. That made me feel as if the gods were in our favor and we were being given a straight shot to the CIA. We entered the outer office and were confronted by the stony glare of the secretary who'd been there on our previous visit. Her hair looked as if it hadn't moved a muscle since then, which added to the effect of her somehow having shellacked it into place. She was wearing a different dress, a knit in an unnaturally bright pink, that no one over 5 years old should wear. Her eyes immediately fastened on us as we came through the door, and she scanned Mother and me as if she'd never seen us before, which didn't say much for the way she tried to memorize us the first time. I didn't feel in the mood to deal with her, so I marched through the office with Mother in tow. "What? Wait!" the secretary said as we passed her desk, but Mother replied simply, "Don't bother to announce us," as I opened the door to the inner office and passed through. The secretary was up like a shot and followed us to the door, barking, "You can't just go in there!" to our backs, and she grabbed hold of the doorknob with a white, spider-like hand and said to the startled Mr. Martin, "I'm sorry, sir, they just barged in." Martin's dull eyes were wide with surprise, then his senatorial lip curled and he looked past us at his secretary and said, "That's all right, Lorraine." Lorraine, it figured. Mother and I both watched her as she narrowed her eyes at us as if she could squeeze poison darts from them, twisted the doorknob, said a quiet, "Very well," to Martin and exited, closing the door noisily behind her. Martin turned to us and his expression transformed from surprise to something approaching condescension. "Well, my two amateur agents," he said, pushing his chair back to expose his protruding stomach, which seemed to be really straining the capacity of his belt. "Mr. Martin," Mother started, but Martin shook his head at her, put his palms up to stop her, and smiled in a way that let us both know that he considered us just short of idiots. "You got me into quite a bit of hot water, you know. I understand that business that the field boys set up last night went sour." "Not through any of our doing," said Mother. She was on her high horse now. "And I told you when you came to our home with that ridiculous scheme that I thought it was too dangerous for us to be participating in." "That you did. I can tell you that the boys are miffed at you for blowing it." "I don't give a bloody damn what your boys are miffed about. My boy could have been killed." "Yeah," I said ineffectually. "Besides, we didn't blow it. That fake Martin guy didn't show up, but one of his buddies did." "So he must have known it was a setup somehow," said Mother. I could now understand the look on Martin's face. We were sounding more idiotic by the minute. I mean, how often does one's mother talk to the CIA about setups and henchmen? "Now, Mother," I said, willing to take some of the heat off the CIA, especially since we now wanted their help. "To be perfectly fair, I told you at the time I thought that man who called himself Martin sounded like he thought it was a setup." "Quite right," said Mother hotly. "All the more reason they shouldn't have involved us." Martin smiled, the condescension in his expression growing. He looked like a congressman who was about to proposition a page. "Well, little lady, you really are a pistol." Both Mother and I gaped at the man, our expressions frozen in incredulity. Martin gave her one of those looks that is meant to convey that the looker is tired of being made a fool of. "You come here with some cock and bull story about being followed by foreign agents and phony government agents coming to your door, and like the big sap I am, I actually buy it. Then the field boy set up some sort of sting last night, and the person you claim has been impersonating me doesn't show up, and some stranger ends up getting himself killed. I should have my head examined for listening to you in the first place, and here you are again. What, did you think up some more stories?" "What are you saying?" said Mother, her jaw dropping with shock. "You two are really something, you know that? You must think I'm a big fool, and I suppose I've given you every reason to believe that, but I'm not as big a fool as you think I am. But I started to protest, but Martin cut me off. He leaned back in his chair with a loud creak and linked his fingers behind his head, once again revealing two identical underarm stains on his shirt. His face beamed some sort of triumph at us as he said, "Is this how you two get your jollies? Making up stories like this and getting everybody all worked up about them? I'll bet they love you down at the police station." The irony of that statement, given Mother's relationship with Frank, was lost on me at that particular moment, since I was still immobilized with disbelief. It was a good thing that Mother took the lead, because my mind and my mouth had gone blank at the same time. I had no idea what to say. "Do you mean to tell me that you don't believe anything we've told you?" "Why, keep it up, lady." There was a second pause, during which I'm sure Mother wondered, as I did, whether or not Martin was joking, but the expression on his pudgy face showed that he was deadly serious. "But what about last night? That man did come. Not the one we were expecting, but his friend, and he tried to kill my son. Would have killed him if one of your men hadn't shot him first." Martin was not to be swayed. "I may not work the field like the other boys, and I may just be the low-class head of personnel, but I recognize horsepucky when I say it." "But why?" "So your boy had the bad luck to have somebody try to hold him up. What the hell do you expect in some out-of-the-way place like that in the middle of the night?" "We didn't choose the place," said Mother indignantly. "So what?" said Martin with an annoying amount of pride in his voice at having worked the whole thing out. And I couldn't help thinking that this wasn't his own idea, that the field boys had come up with the scenario and delivered it to him. So what if some hold-up man had the bad luck to try it on with somebody that was being covered by the CIA? "A hold-up man," I exclaimed. "But he was one of the men who attacked Alex in the bar. He said to him, 'Please, lady, spare me any more of the stories, all right? I'm not in the mood for any more fairy tales.'" When he said this last part, he lowered his head slightly and stared up at me from under his eyebrows. I was really angry with myself, because I could feel my face reddening with anger at his cheap shot, and I would have given my right arm to avoid having this big oaf thinking he'd gotten to me. Besides, we still hadn't gotten to the point of our visit, and it was an important point, though I already felt we were lost. "So if you don't mind me saying so, you've taken up enough of my time. You think you could tell me why you came here today?" said Martin. A tiny bit of saliva darted into the corner of his mouth. "We've come about the matchbook," I said. Martin stared at me in disbelief. It was a look that shouldn't have surprised me, given everything he just said, but the look on his face was mixed with uncertainty, and that did surprise me. He licked away the bit of saliva, then suddenly slapped his palms against the top of his desk and laughed derisively. "Don't that beat all? After that bunch of crap yesterday, you've come to me about that crappin' matchbook? That really does beat all." I took a deep breath to quell my anger and said, "Mr. Martin, this is a serious matter." He laughed again and said, "I'm just sure it is. We need the matchbook back." He stopped laughing for a fraction of a second, then laughed even more loudly. It sounded false and mocking. I would have given anything to have slapped him hard with the back of my hand, but I couldn't afford any such gesture at that moment. He made a show of calming himself down, smoothing the greasy hair back off his forehead, and said, "So you want the matchbook back? Why? It had sentimental value or something?" "Mr. Martin," said Mother, her tone trying desperately to convey that this was very serious. "Peter, Alex's friend, has been—" He cut her off. "I told you I don't want to hear any more stories. Has been kidnapped," Mother continued, closing her eyes for a brief moment to draw the strength to maintain her composure, "by one of the foreign agents, the partner of the one who was shot last night. They want what Victor Haycheck gave to my son, the matchbook. But we gave it to you. We have to get it back. We have to give it to them." Martin had replaced his finger behind his head, and with an expression of utmost smugness had watched Mother as she'd spoken. I could have killed him. He looked as if he were humoring a precocious child. "Why? That's real exciting, ma'am." Mother looked shocked. "Mr. Martin, but if these bad guys want this matchbook back, they're out of luck." "What do you mean?" I said, and my voice sounded so choked I barely recognized it as my own. Martin leaned forward as in a sudden angry movement and slapped his fist down on his desktop. "Because I passed it on to the field boys. I passed it on because I believe that story you told me. Why the hell do you think I'm in such hot water?" Mother's forehead creased heavily. She shook her head and turned her palms up questioningly, as if she would have liked to ask him why he couldn't get the word out. He noticed her discomfiture, but didn't wait for the question before he said, "Because there was nothing in it." "What?" we said in unison. "There was nothing in it. Nothing in it at all. It was just an ordinary matchbook." "That's impossible," I said hotly. They went over it with a fine-tooth comb. Didn't find nothing." "But there has to be something," said Mother. He simply shook his head at her. "And believe me, nobody's too happy about it. As for getting it back, I'm sure whatever was left when the boys got through with it has been pitched by now." Outcome, the soiled handkerchief that we had yet to see on this visit. He mopped his forehead with it and shoved it unceremoniously into his back pocket. Then he smoothed back his hair again and turned his watery eyes from Mother to me and back again. His expression became more serious. "Look, you wasted enough of our time. Why don't you run on home now?" I was about to open my mouth and protest, but Mother stood up suddenly and said, "Well, I guess we'll get no more help here." "That's right," Martin replied, his bushy eyebrows arching over his dull eyes. "Come along, Alex," said Mother. I looked at her as if I thought we should try further, especially with Peter's life at stake, but I realized that she was probably right. We were just wasting our time here. I rose from my chair, but Martin remained in his, not bothering with even the most perfunctory politeness. Mother opened the door, and I almost collided with her when she stopped suddenly and turned back to Martin. "Oh," she said, "I almost forgot." She started to rummage in her purse and said to me, "Maybe he can help us with our list." "Huh?" was my ineffectual reply. Mother pulled the little notebook out of her purse and flipped through the pages, trying to find her place. "Mr. Martin, I wonder if you could tell us if you've ever heard of—" She turned 3 more pages before she found the one with the list, then stopped, tapping the list with her index finger, and said, "Matthew Corbin?" The effect was as if she had hit him under the chin with a 2x4. Martin had been playing at looking through documents on his desk to make us feel even more insignificant while we exited. When Mother said the name, Martin's head snapped back with enough force to propel his chair back about half a foot. His eyes were wide and glazed. He took barely 30 seconds to think before he shook his head angrily and said, "No, I've never heard of anybody like that. No, I'm busy." Or Larry Weiler, or Joseph Smith, Andrew Peterson, Robert Dixon?" "Mrs. Reynolds," said Martin, making a great show of reaching the end of his patience, but looking a little too pale at this point to carry it off. "I said I'm busy. If you don't mind." Mother smiled. "Not at all." "Do you think he was telling the truth? I mean, that there being nothing in the matchbook. Maybe there really was something and they just don't want to admit it." "I hope not. I'd like to think the CIA would do something to help us get Peter back if the matchbook still existed." "And if they didn't think we were crackpots?" "Yes," said Mother slowly. "What are we going to do now? The matchbook was the only thing we had to trade, and it doesn't even exist anymore." Mother's face grew grave with thought, and I was sure at that point that this case was going to further line her face. She said, "The only thing we have to go on is this list of names." "Why did you ask him about Corbin?" "I don't know. I suppose that maybe the real agents had told him something about what they were working on, and maybe he'd heard the name." "What about that?" I said, my own face wrinkling. "What about the way Martin reacted when you mentioned those names?" "That was quite odd," said Mother. Then her lip, which had been pursed, relaxed into a smile. "You know, it's a good thing for Mr. Martin that he's only in personnel. He certainly would have made a very good agent." "No, he didn't do very well hiding that he'd heard of them. That means Corbin must have something to do with the CIA business." "But, darling, you've heard of Matthew Corbin, too." I sighed heavily, once again feeling as if we were simply running around in circles. We pondered our current problem in silence for a couple of minutes, and we stood there waiting for the street light to change. When it did and we started across the street, I said, "So how do we go about identifying the names on that list?" "Well," said Mother slowly, "there's always the library. We can check out the current who's who and whatnot." "For God's sake, we have less than 3 hours now." "I don't know what else to do. You know the library will also have the newspaper indexes, so if they've done something noteworthy recently, they'll probably "Oh my God," I said loudly, coming to a stop in the middle of the street. It's a credit to Chicago that none of our fellow pedestrians even turned their heads except for the couple that barked something at me about getting out of their way. "Alex, what is it?" I turned to her slowly, my mouth hanging open, both in surprise and stupidity. "Kidnapping! I just remembered where I saw Matthew Corbin's name." There it was in glorious black and white. American Businessman returned. Mother had thankfully not yet thrown out the Sunday paper, so it was still in a brown paper bag beside the kitchen garbage can, waiting it, as Mother put it, for one of her darling boys to take it to the alley. I retrieved it, spread it on the kitchen table, and paged through it quickly, trying to find the article I had scanned briefly on Saturday, and there it was. The article was about an American businessman, Matthew Corbin, who had been abducted in Moscow and held for ransom. After 11 days and nights, the company for which Corbin worked had paid the ransom through an unknown source, and Corbin had been returned. Unfortunately, Corbin could apparently offer no information whatsoever about his abductors. He had been attacked from behind, then blindfolded. The only thing he had to say was that his abductors had not harmed him, except during the initial attack when he was taken, but that he hadn't eaten well while in captivity. "That's all very interesting," said Mother, "but what does it tell us?" "A lot of things. One is that the man who called himself Martin must have some connection to this. Why else would we find Corbin's name on a fax in his room? He must have something to do with the kidnapping, and I'll bet if we did go through the newspaper indexes at the library, we'd find that these other 4 men were also kidnapped victims." "Maybe," said Mother doubtfully, "but that doesn't explain what Victor Haychek and Volkov and Fomin, as well as this bogus Martin fellow, are doing here. All that kidnapping is going on in Russia." "Not all of it," I said pointedly. Mother shook her head ruefully. "You're right about that, but that still leaves us with the question, what are they doing here? I would think that if you have money, Russia isn't that bad a place to be, sort of like New York." So, if they are involved in some sort of kidnapping ring, and they're at all successful at it, as these people are," she tapped the newspaper article, "then you'd think they'd be doing all right in Russia." "Mother, I'm really missing something here." She sighed and said, "What I'm trying to say is, if they're kidnapping Americans for money, and they're getting away with it, then you'd think they'd be safe as long as they were in Russia. But you know, they don't take kindly to kidnapping here in America." I rolled my eyes at this because Mother's penchant for the natural understatement of the British has a habit of rearing its head at the oddest moments. "No, honestly, Alex, you would think America would be the last place they'd want to be." I thought about that for a moment, then suddenly the gates in my brain blew open. The flood poured through, and for the first time in days, I thought I had some inkling as to what the hell was going on around here. Unless... I do hate it when you do that, darling. Unless what? Unless something went wrong. Oh my God. We've got to get Peter away from these people right away. That is when it happened. I reached into my shirt pocket for my pack of Marlboro Lights and drew a cigarette out of the pack. As I did, I heard a soft, muted rattle in the pack. I looked into the opening and shook the pack, which was now about 2/3 full, and though I saw something move, I glanced at Mother, then turned the pack over and let the object slide out onto the newspaper. It was a small gray cylinder, no wider than a cigarette, but about half its length. I had no idea what it was, but I knew exactly how it had gotten there. The moment I saw it, I realized what Haychek had done. When I'd handed him the pack, which at the time was only shy 2 or 3 cigarettes, he slipped this thing into it, shoving it back and down between the tightly packed cigarettes. It hadn't worked its way free until I'd smoked a few more. Actually, several more in the past couple of hours. "That bastard," I said. "He set me up." "What do you mean?" said Mother, looking at the little gray tube that lay in the palm of my hand. "I mean he set me up. That matchbook was a blind. It's this thing they're after." "I thought they were after the matchbook." "That's just it. Don't you see? They don't know what they're after. Even the phony Martin told us that. They don't know what Haychek was carrying. They just knew that he was going to pass it to somebody here. That motherfucker slipped that goddamn matchbook into my pocket as a blind." Mother said half-heartedly, "Alex, please, your language..." I ignored this. I found my language perfectly valid for this occasion. "Think about it, Mother. He let them see him put that damn matchbook in my pocket when he'd already slipped this into my cigarette pack. How? I gave him the damn pack to take out a cigarette. Well, I still don't see. Mother, this way it didn't matter what happened to me. As long as those foreign guys thought they were after the matchbook, it didn't even matter if they killed me. They probably wouldn't have bothered with my cigarettes. Mother's eyes were riveted to the little tube as I rolled it between my thumb and forefinger. She was obviously putting this all together in her head, and when she was finished, without moving her head, she swiveled her eyes in my direction and said, "That son of a bitch." "Yeah, that son of a bitch," I echoed and closed my fist around the tube and took out a cigarette. "Now we know what they were after," said Mother as I lit up, "but we don't know what it is." I smiled at her, my eyes narrowing. "I don't know what it is to them, but I know what it is to me. A claim ticket to redeem Peter." Mother looked at me in a way that made me fear that rough weather was ahead. Her eyelids drooped to about half-mast, and she sucked in the right side of her lips. "What?" I said, trying to mask my apprehension with irritation. "Well," she said as she folded her arms across her chest, "if these really are the same people who kidnapped that man in Russia, they're professionals." She stopped, and I prodded her on with a simple, "Yes?" "It's comforting to know that, if we can go by the story in the paper, that if we do what they want, they'll release Peter." "Yes." She took the little tube from me, held it between two fingers, and shook it. "Whatever this is, it must put the kidnappers in jeopardy. Why else would they go to so much trouble to retrieve it?" I was afraid I knew where she was going with this, but I really didn't want to answer her. I just answered her with, "So?" Mother could always read me like a book. She laid her hand on my arm and kept her voice even but firm. "Alex, these are very bad people. We know they kidnapped Peter. We think they kidnapped that man in Russia, and they probably kidnapped all the people on that list and put them and their families through what we're going through now." "So," I said, pulling my arm away from her, "I don't care about all those people. I just want to get Peter back safely. That's the only thing that's important to me." "I know that, darling. And it's the most important thing to me, too, but there's something else that's important. These people need to be stopped. Not at the expense of Peter." Mother smiled and rolled the tube between her fingers. "Well, darling, if we're clever, maybe we can do both." I raised an eyebrow at her, and she turned her glistening blue eyes at me and said those fateful words, "I've got an idea." Oh, Lord, I thought, once again I'm Ethel Mertz. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.